It's the night of April 25th, and Brock Bowers is available to the Cincinnati Bengals at pick 18. What has to happen for the Bengals to pull the trigger? Let's break it down.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Lisco. He's your host, James Rapine. Today, we spent some time talking about some either-ors and trying to figure out what needs to happen for the Bengals to pick Brock Bowers and for us to be comfortable with that selection. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network here on Locked On Bengals, covering your team every day. We're available everywhere you get your podcasts and on YouTube. So if you're new to the show and you're looking to find everyday content on the Cincinnati Bengals, it's a great time to subscribe to the podcast, whether that's on YouTube or on an audio platform. Become an everydayer, and we appreciate all of you out there who make us your first listen and who are already everydayers on the Locked On Bengals podcast. And James, you perhaps are a little bit clearer on where Brock Bowers is in your pecking order than I am at this point. But one way to go through this exercise is we've pitted prospects against each other in our bracket for the first round pick for the last few weeks or week or so, is by just saying either or. And what players would you pick ahead of Brock Bowers, and talking about the merits and demerits and debating the pros and cons for each of those decisions?
Yeah, I think it's the debate, it's the conversation that I think most Bengals fans are having right now. And there are a lot of people that say, hell no, don't take a tight end. And including some that covered the team in round one. Others that think that Brock Bowers is a surefire pick and take him. And then there's people that are in the middle where it's like, yeah, we'll take him if this guy's gone, if that guy's there, give the edge to Brock, or you give the edge to that offensive lineman or that defensive lineman or whatever the case is, that cornerback. Heck, some, at least our audience, says that receiver potentially with Brian Thomas Jr. You mentioned me seeing clearly with it or thinking clearly or whatever the case is. I just know what happens when you give Joe Burrow elite weapons. And I get it. I know people want to add the elite offensive lineman, and I wouldn't take Brock over every single offensive lineman in this class. But it's close. There are only a few, I think, that when you have Joe Burrow, you ignore the weapon element of it, assuming that Brock is who I think he is. And I think he can be as good as any tight end that we've seen come into the draft over the past few years. That includes Sam Laporta, who was awesome last year, who the Bengals passed on. That includes Dalton Kincaid, who the Bengals probably would have taken. We don't know for sure, but probably would have taken at pick 28 had he made it to the Bengals last year. And so if you feel that strongly, we know what he does with great weapons. Why not give Burrow one more and a guy like Brock Bowers?
Yeah, the conversation comes to positional value, comes to a bunch of hypotheticals. You kind of have to assume the player is going to hit to have the debates or the discussions in the first place. I think you can talk a little bit about, the risk of a bust and kind of try to bake that into the conversation as well. The one thing that stood out to me and what you were just talking about, James, is yes, we do know what happens when you give Joe Burrow great weapons. He's great at finding them. He's an excellent point guard. He knows where the ball should go. And when you have guys that can consistently do their job, he's going to be able to read coverages and get the ball to the player that has the best chance to do the most with the ball. And there's maybe a little bit of preference for Jamar Chase because of the relationship those guys have, the trust those guys have in one another to make some crazy plays, breaking the rules, going outside of structure with little hand gestures and nods before the play to make little adjustments at the line of scrimmage. They have a different kind of connection. And yeah, you would like more of that in terms of long-term pieces for the Bengals. And that's one thing that is actually a pretty strong argument in Brock Bowers' favor. On the one hand, you lose some of that surplus value that you get on a rookie deal when you have a first-round tight end, because tight end is not one of the more expensive positions in the NFL. And you're paying draft picks based on their draft slot, not their position. So you're paying Brock Bowers more relative to his position than you would potentially at some other positions that we're going to talk about that the Bengals would consider in the first round. So from like a money surplus value perspective, you're losing a little bit on that rookie deal with Bowers. But on the other hand, if they think that he's good and he's deserving of that extension, just 21 coming into the league, and they want to keep him for 9 years or 10 years and get him for his entire NFL prime, well, then that second deal, when you have a potential big contract for Joe Burrow still going on, you have the big contract potentially for Jamar Chase nearing the end of its first extension, potentially by the time you get around to the Brock Bowers extension. Well, that Bowers extension isn't going to cost you as much unless the tight
Sure.
end landscape dramatically changes between now and then. So while you do lose a
Unless
little
he
bit of money,
changes it because he
yeah.
has 150 catches and 32 touchdowns in a season.
Well, I think that if Kelsey can't change it with the production that he's had and the importance that he carries for the Kansas City Chiefs, I'm skeptical that it can change. But you never know. Like these things can change. It just takes one player, right, to reset the market in a significant way.
Yeah, and so a couple of things there. Travis Kelce makes $14 million per year. The Bengals would have to pay Brock Bowers like 16 over 4. It's not crazy. To your
Oh yeah,
point,
no,
it's not the same value, but this isn't like a Kyle Pitts just complete get awful value unless he's amazing right away.
right,
Like it's not crazy money that the Bengals would have to spend because it's the 18th pick.
right.
But to your point, it isn't as good a value as if you could get your starting right tackle for the next 4 years for 16 million. So that part is worth noting for sure.
Or defensive tackle. Like both of those markets are insane.
Sure. Yeah, no doubt. No, especially if they hit. Like if they all end up hitting. Like if you told me, would you rather have this elite tight end, this number, because I think Brock Bowers has a chance to be the best tight end in the league. And then let's insert whatever lineman, Latham or Mims or whoever, top 10. I think it's unrealistic to say, all right, they're going to be the best lineman in the league. And so I think that's interesting. But even top 10 is making more than Bowers would make by far because of where they're valued in what they bring and how rare they are. So let's
do that real quick. Let's talk about some of the higher end players, not necessarily the best of their position, but let's say it's like who's the right tackle we want to use for this? Who's like a solid but not the best in the NFL right tackle, like a Bernard Raymond or
better than Jonah.
Much better than Jonah.
I'm asking, like, you're thinking better than Jonah.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, okay, you're making a joke. I don't see your facial expression right. Like Jordan Mailata or yeah, Raymond, Christian Darrisaw. Maybe let's say Christian Darrisaw at tackle.
Okay.
So Christian Darrisaw, the right tackle, or for an interior defensive lineman, who do we want to take for interior defensive line? Geno Atkins is too good, but very familiar to Bengals fans. But he's probably too good. Who's a good interior option?
Jeffrey Simmons is too good. You got to go lower. Like those are game wreckers. Like Chris Jones, like obviously.
Maybe like a Christian Barmore.
Christian Barmore is good. Okay. Yeah. No, that's a good one.
A guy the
Bengals cast on him. For Jackson Carman.
Or even Justin Madubuike, you could say. So let's say Madubuike or Barmore. So you got a really good right tackle, a couple of really good defensive tackles, or say at tight end, Sam Laporta. I know what your answer is. Maybe that's too high at tight end if you think Sam Laporta is because we took like top 10 tackles. But you think Bowers, if you pick him, it's going to be at least Laporta.
I think that's reasonable because you're not spending the 18th pick on Bowers unless you think he can be a top 3 tight end. Like, unless you think he can be the elite of elite. You're drafting a tackle if he's the top player on your board and you think he has a shot to be a top 15 tackle in the league, you take it, right? Because it's that much harder, offensive tackle wise. And then defensive tackle, heck, top 10 is probably top 5. It's similar in that way, I think, with how the Bengals view it. But yeah,
maybe
I think
Trey McBride or Cole Kmet in year one anyway. I don't know. Trey
Yeah, I mean,
McBride's
Trey
really good.
McBride in year 2 for Bowers in year 1, sure.
Yeah.
I think Bowers is a plug and play, though, because if not, you don't take it. Like, if
Mhm.
you don't view him that way, it's not worth it. But I think he is worth it, and we should continue the conversation as, we roll on because it's one of the many draft debates, and we will, coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime.com and the Gametime app is where you need to go right now to get all of your tickets, whether it's Reds tickets, and the Reds have another homestand coming up this weekend. And maybe there's a specific game on Saturday or Sunday, one that you're targeting that you want to attend. Well, the good news is you could go downtown, you could check out Holy Grail, you could bounce around, maybe get some tacos at Condado, or maybe you're going to eat at Holy Grail too, because they do have great food. Shout out to Jim and the crew. And then you decide to get tickets right then that you want to stroll on over and go to Great American Ballpark for the game. Game Time is the place to do it because you can get last minute tickets. You can see the view from your seat in the app, so you know exactly what you're getting. There's no hidden fees. They do have flash deals, zone deals, and it is super convenient. Make sure you check them out right now in the Gametime app or gametime.com. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed.
It's pretty challenging to come up with good comparable professionals for that either or. Because
Well, I think Laporta is fair because if you're drafting him at 18, and not that he will have the same exact numbers, but that the Bengals would make him such a big part of their offense right away. And I do think that they would. Like that he would be their 2A and potentially their 2 as soon as 2025, depending on what happens with T. Higgins.
you could even take a couple of Ravens and just say straight up, would you rather have Matabike or
Or
Mark
Andrews.
Andrews? Yeah,
On
it's kind of interesting.
It is. I also think, which one is more likely? That Johnny Newton becomes Matabike in year 1, or that Bowers has an impact like Mark Andrews in year 1? Because I think that the defensive line, it could take a few years. I just
It could,
do.
but often a tight end, it takes a few years. So if you're picking Brock Bowers, you're hoping that he's the exception to that rule. And there are some exceptions to that rule in recent history, Laporta being the chief among those. But it's not like it's unheard of lately, especially if you kind of simplify that rule in year 1 and you don't ask him to know a ton of things, and you have a very clear idea of what he's going to be for you, which would primarily be a dynamic receiver. But when we talk about prospects this year, the decisions that I think we have to talk about, like we don't have to talk about Joe Alt and Brock Bowers because Joe Alt's going to be long gone. That's so unrealistic and outside of the world of possibility. We don't have to talk about it. It's probably Joe Alt. But if you talk about Brock Bowers and Newton, which we just talked about quite a bit, well, that's where you have to think about what are the chances that those guys hit. And both of them have very similar profiles for their position. And then you have to think about, well, which of those do you value more? And then you can maybe shoot for the high end. Say it's actually like a Geno Watkins versus Sam Laporta. And you really assume that Johnny Newton's going to hit, and you feel that strongly about Johnny Newton.
Sure.
Then what do you do?
Well, then you go that route, of course, if it's Geno Atkins, right? But that's the debate is, if it's Geno, most of the time the Genos of the world don't fall. We've talked about it with defensive tackle. Like the high end guys are picked early, really early on. And there's only 2 that are going to be in the running in the first round, at least first 20 picks. And so Johnny Newton obviously is someone that a lot of people are going to compare to Geno. Bengals Twitter loves him and Bengals fans love him. Do the Bengals think he can be that? Because if he can, then I get it. I really do. If not, if you think he's a good defensive tackle, projects to be good, not necessarily great, well, where do you project Brock Bowers? Maybe they're not as high on Brock as I am, where he's a top 7 to 8 prospect in this class. Or maybe they're not as high on Johnny as consensus is, and I am. I think he's the number 1 defensive tackle in this class. And so that's that's the part that we don't know yet. Hopefully we'll know before draft day, but it's just where they stand, or at least have an idea on draft day. It's not like we'll see their board, but we usually get a pretty good idea between now and the draft of what they're thinking, how they're thinking. And that's the difference. Which one's the game changer? Because I'm pretty certain in my mind that they'll view Brock Bowers as a game changer, but maybe they don't. And if they don't, then the conversation's it's done there because they won't take him. But I think that if they do view him as a game changer, it's going to be really tough to pass on him, regardless of who's there.
And I think we need to see him test. He's got a workout planned, along with Amarius Mims, by the way, for April 10th. But then
Huge.
what about like Quinyon Mitchell Brock Bowers, or Fuaga Brock Bowers, or pick a tackle. I think that Fuaga, Fashanu, and we're about to probably have a Fashanu Bowers matchup in our bracket. Those are the most likely guys you're considering really strongly. And maybe Mims Bowers is a conversation as well, depending on how they feel about Amarius Mims. Are there any of those
could have
guys?
Mims. They could have Mims ahead of some of those tackles you just named.
Oh yeah,
Like
that's why I bring him up. But
Yeah.
are there any of those guys, Mitchell, Fuaga, Mims, Latham, Fatanu, that you're like, that's too good? The position value is too strong, and I think that needs to go ahead of Bowers.
Man, I love Mitchell, but I got to go with Bowers, right? Like it's tough, and I default that there is some bias here in a sense that I want to make sure 9 has everything he could possibly want, and then some. I know that's the key, and so whether it's protecting him, giving him another weapon, if it's 50 cents on one hand and 50 cents on the other, the tiebreaker is all right. Help Joe, and so I would put Bowers ahead of Quinyon Mitchell. Some of those others are interesting. I think Fuaga and Fashanu are the two that are tough because I think those are the two guys that could be really, really high. And then the other one is Mims, because I think there's a scenario where we look up in a few years and he's the best tackle in this class. That would not shock me. Now, do things need to happen? Does he need to hit the right city, the right culture, the right all of those things? Sure. Well, what do the Bengals have? They have a lot of those things, and everyone hates Frank Pollock, but he's never had someone like this to work with in Amarius Mims. So I wouldn't be shocked if the Bengals went with Mims. I would be hard. It would still be hard for me to pass on Brock. I would say maybe Fashanu might be the only one. And even then I'd be hesitant because I just think Brock Bowers is that high end. And then the other element of this is how many of these guys are going to be around? How many tight ends? I know last year's tight end class was really good. It's not like there's a ton of tight ends every year. I know there's not a ton of offensive linemen either. I do think that they can get a quality tackle in round 2, which I get it. I know how it sounds, and I know they blew it last time we had that debate. So I'll give that that disclaimer out there right now.
I'm not very confident they can get a good tackle in round 2. So you and I do differ there. And so
you don't think there'll be a good tackle available in round 2? I'm not saying they'll get it right. I'm saying that there will be a good tackle available in round 2.
I'm not confident that by the time they pick, there's going to be a guy that you're very comfortable taking in the
Blake Fisher.
Round. I don't know if I'm comfortable with Fisher in the second round where they pick.
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe. I'm not there with Patrick Paul.
No, not in round 2. Nope. They might be. That's what's scary. They might be now. And so that to your argument, you would want the tackle in round 1. Would you want Mims in round 1 or Bowers in round 1 if it meant Patrick Paul in round 2, or just leave it open in round 2?
Yeah, I would take the tackle.
I agree.
And that's part of it.
2.
That's part of it for me, is that you with taking a first round tackle this year, those guys are good. They're really good. It's a uniquely good tackle class at the top. But Kingsley Suamataia, who's my favorite second round tackle, he's not going to make it most likely to the Bengals pick in the second round. Are they going to trade up to try to get him? Doubt it. That's not in their blood, but maybe. The problem is just that the reason it's so hard for me is that all the great tackles in this class are at the top of the draft. If you wait, you're really rolling the dice. And it would be really great to inject some youth, some athleticism, some upside into that offensive line at an important position, even though I know Brock Bowers does a lot of those things at a different position, they can get weapons in other ways. They can get other weapons in this draft, even if they
Mhm.
draft Brock Bowers. But there is not such an opportunity to get a premium talent at offensive line later in the draft.
No, I get it. You mentioned trading up. I'd want to give you one more scenario, and then we'll get to some prospects that did visit Cincinnati coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. The sports calendar is locked. It's loaded. The Final Fours are set, and Caitlin Clark still balling. Jake was watching. I was watching on Monday night, and boy, oh boy, I must watch. The way she's playing, shooting from the logo, the passing skills, controlling the entire game, the entire offense rolling through her. So maybe you think that Iowa's going to handle business, or that UConn, both men and women, are going to win it all regardless. Right now, new customers with FanDuel get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. So throw $5 on your favorite NBA team, your favorite baseball team. You win, you get $200 in bonus bets that you can spread out across the tournament, baseball, NBA, NHL, and so much more. All you have to do is visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a big win. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook.
What's this trade up scenario you want to float to me, James?
Would you, if you knew, let's say Amarius Mims is there and Brock Bowers is there at 18, and you knew you had a crystal ball that you could trade the 49th pick and pick 97 to get Kingsley Suamataia, would you, to whatever pick you'd have to move up into the second round, but those are the two picks you give up. Would you take Mims and just keep your draft assets, or would you take Bowers and get Suamataia?
I think Suamataia does need time to cook,
Yeah. Yep.
but I think he might have that time, and he's only 21. I would be, I think, as of today, and the disclaimers that this can always change, be comfortable with that trade up.
Yeah,
personally.
baby. Yeah, baby. I agree with you. I do. Because they accomplish two things at both spots. You get these high-end players, high-end athletes, guys that project to be hopefully really, really good at their respective positions. And yeah, you give up that comp pick. And I know they don't view it this way, but I would kind of view it this way because it's really nice in simulators to have. I know it. But if you can use that to get another premium piece and use 49 and 97 to get up to wherever to get that other premium player, that was a 6th round comp pick a month ago. That wasn't a 3rd rounder. And I know it wasn't supposed to be that, and they fixed it and all of those things. Fine. But man, it just almost feels like a bonus where you could kind of sneak up and use that. Now, maybe not. Maybe it wouldn't work, and maybe you can't find the right trade partner, but just a scenario I wanted to throw out there.
And there are a couple of guys that I'd be comfortable with in that role. Like if Tyler Guyton gets into the top of the 2nd round,
Sure.
I'm comfortable with it there. It's after watching a little bit more of Tyler Guyton, I'm less afraid of him as a prospect than I was previously. He does have some really tantalizing traits, but similar to Mims, doesn't have the experience, and similar to Suamataia needs to put some technique stuff together at the next level. And dissimilar to both of those guys, he's 23, we think. I'm pretty sure he's 23, at least based on the information we have today. So not to get too far down the Tyler Guyton conversation again, but it's not just Suamataia, for example. If you could get a falling tackle that you felt good about, in addition to Bowers and trade up to do so, I think I'd be okay with that because then you still have your 3rd round pick.
You know what you don't do? You don't take a tackle that's projected to go in round 4 by literally everybody in round 2.
Yeah.
That's what you don't do. And I'm not going to reference exactly what that was, but real ones know. Probably everyone knows what I'm referring to.
Yeah, everyone.
Mason,
the other thing that I think is tricky about the whole like Bowers versus like Fuaga Fatanu conversations, for example, is like, do the Bengals see those guys as tackles?
I know.
Because a lot of people are not so sure about that.
Which is a very real reason why, and this is turning into an offensive tackle conversation, but that's fine. Mims could be ahead of all of them.
Mhm.
All of those dudes, all of the Fuaga, and certainly Fatanu. And so what if he's their second tackle on their board? What if
Oh,
it's
he
Alton
might be.
Mims?
Yeah.
He might be.
Yeah.
Would not shock me. And I think there's a chance Mims is that. So buckle up. I know that there's all this. We'll have to have a whole nother conversation about Amarius Mims. Hopefully he tests well in later this month on April 10th with Brock Bowers. That'll be a big pro day that we'll have to cover for sure.
Yeah, it's a big one. They're expected to work out on April 10th, and hopefully that holds up. James, you started to transition to our final topic today, which is that the Bengals hosted a couple of, or at least a couple of draft prospects, perhaps more. It was hard to tell from the evidence from social media that we have, but Mason Smith posted a photo on social media driving by Paycor Stadium in Cincinnati, Ohio, and Dijon Anthony, an Ole Miss safety, projected to go between the late fifth round to priority free agent, depending on where you look, are a couple of guys that were in town for the Bengals. And Mason Smith tested pretty well. Louisiana State defensive tackle. He's tall, 6'5", only 306 at 6'5". Certainly not a nose tackle body type. One of our pal draft guy Jared's three defensive tackle fits for the Bengals outside of the first round, in addition to Tavondre Sweat and McKinley Jackson. I've seen Mason Smith with a consensus third round grade is where we have him right now in our draft spreadsheet that is as yet unreleased, but could give you an idea of some of the guys the Bengals are looking at, both late day 2 or maybe early to mid day 3.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think from a defensive tackle standpoint, buckle up because there are only two. It's a lot like corner. And I know it's a bigger need and everyone's prioritizing it more. But if the Bengals aren't all in on one of those two guys, and there's a very real scenario that they're not at 18 because of Amarius Mims or Brock Bowers or insert whoever you want, then they're going to go after defensive tackle on day 2. And that's probably what they plan on doing. And so looking at Mason Smith and getting a clearer picture there, I think that makes sense. I'm sure they're looking at Michael Hall Jr., who's popular. I'm sure they're looking at Dwayne Carter. I'm sure they're looking at day 3 guys. By the way, I forget who. There was someone on social media that was discussing this, and it was when the draft graph came out. I think you might have shared it, but they haven't taken an interior defensive lineman on day 2 since 2012.
Yeah,
And,
which was
and
Devin
so
Still.
Devin Still. That's going to change this year, unless they take one in on day 1, which would be
That
the
was
first
day
time
1
since.
or 2.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I see what you're saying.
Day 1 is 94.
Yeah.
Day 2 is 2012. So 2012, I was still in college at the University of Cincinnati. Go Bearcats. 1994, I was 3, and clearly I like Power Rangers. If you can see my background on YouTube, Power Ranger style. So it's been a while, to say the least.
If only one of these tackles was named Billy to go with your Blue Ranger helmet over your right shoulder there.
Is there a Jason? Because I have a red
there's
Ranger.
one down there.
Yeah, Peter Parker. I have a Spider-Man helmet. There's no Peter.
I don't think any of those names are represented a defensive tackle very well this year.
What else do I have? Will? Is there a Will? I got Will Smith behind me.
Surely there's a Will somewhere in this draft.
Is there an Oliver or a Queen? Oliver Queen is behind me. Kobe?
Mason Smith, just to get back to Mason Smith, is on the younger end, probably needs some development time, is very high cut, like I mentioned, 6'5", and not terribly heavy for 6'5" at 305 pounds. Was a 5-star recruit coming out of high school before he went to LSU. And one of the younger, like I said, one of the few underclassmen defensive tackles in this draft, and didn't really put together the college tape that you would like to check all the boxes, but when you have the traits that he has, that's why you enter the draft early anyway, and he will be drafted off those traits. He's certainly a traits guy. He tested, like I said, like a strong athlete, 90th percentile athlete, and has some promising pass rush productivity, especially in true pass rush situations, like meaning not play action, not run pass option, and not quick game. So there's something there. He did have a knee injury that caused him to lose 2022. He had an ACL, but
Mhm.
there's a reason that you bring a guy like that in that has those traits to get a closer look. And I think that's what the Bengals are doing there with a guy that, if he's there at the right time, they might be comfortable pulling the trigger. Not necessarily my favorite target if it's a day 2 pick, if it's a round 3 pick, but maybe with that comp pick, if they keep it at 97, maybe round 4 if he makes it
Maybe he
there.
falls. He could fall to
Yeah,
round 4. That's not
could
crazy.
could could for sure, but he does have crazy traits, like top end traits that some team could fall in love with.
For sure. And I think these are the guys that the Bengals should be looking at and exploring just to see if it's worth it, if it's not, because you evaluate that when you look at the depth of certain positions as they're evaluating a Johnny Newton. Is it worth it at 18? Okay, maybe it is, maybe it's not. And if they think, maybe, but there's a bunch of depth here, or maybe it is worth it because there's not a bunch of depth there. And so that's something that they'll work out between now and April 25th when the draft starts.
And it'll be interesting. Something I have to check, and I'll check at some point before the draft, is the kind of guys they've used these visits on, these in-person hosting visits the last few years, because there might be a pattern there, and I can't remember what it is, but I think there is a pattern there. So I'll take a look at the information we have there for previous years, and we'll try to keep track of all of those. They're allowed 30 visits in person where they host some players. We're pretty sure they had some in yesterday, in addition to the 2 guys we've discussed. But we'll keep an eye on that going forward as well as they finish up their draft prep in Cincinnati with a couple pro days left, some important workouts like we discussed, and continuing to host some guys for those official visits. Until next time, that's going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Thanks for listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.